Chapter 3. When consciousness slowly throbbed back into Pat Stevens' lank body, his first hazy thought was that it had stopped raining. He still lay face down just as he had fallen, and his right arm was painfully crumpled beneath him. He lay without moving for a long time, groping back with his thoughts, and gradually picked up a disjointed memory of what had happened. The girl had shot him. He remembered that clearly enough. Her first bullet had smashed into his right arm. He had a vague recollection of one or two more shots following the first. He tried flexing the fingers of his right hand, crushed under the weight of his body. They were numb and felt stuck together, but they responded to his will. That was when he discovered that he was lying on a wooden floor instead of in the mud where he had fallen. His knuckles were bruised by the floor as he had opened and closed his fingers. He blinked one eye open and caught a glimpse of a yellow light from a kerosene lamp, and he saw a pair of feminine shoes sitting squarely on the floor in his line of vision and not more than 10 feet distant. They were dainty, black pumps, but right now they were heavily encrusted with mud. Slender, unstockly ankles rose out of the black shoes, and above the ankles was the swell of a smooth young calf, and his view was modestly cut off above that point by the hem of a gingham skirt. Pat could see no more without moving his head. He closed his eyes to rest a moment before making that effort. The upper portion of his body was a solid mass of pain, and in his weakened and semi-conscious condition, it seemed to Pat that he could feel his blood and his life slowly ebbing out of his open wounds. He wondered what kind of girl it was who would deliberately shoot a stranger without warning, drag his unconscious body inside out of the rain, and then calmly seat herself in a chair and watch him bleed to death. All sorts of fantastic images formed in his mind as he lay there with closed eyes. She must be some kind of female ogre, a soulless, heartless creature without a spark of human mercy in her well-formed body. He recalled that single glimpse he had had of her before she fired, the suggestion of wild freedom at bay. He set his teeth together hard and shifted his head so that he could see all the way up to the girl's face. She met his eyes with an intent, fixed gaze. She sat in a straight-backed wooden chair, bent slightly forward with elbows resting on her knees. A pointed chin was nestled in the palms of tanned hands, and thin, bloodless lips were twisted in an expression of angry scorn. A large caliber, long-barreled revolver lay carelessly upon her thighs. She made no movement. She did not shift her gaze as Pat Stevens stared up at her from the floor. She was about 18, he guessed, and had a hard look of self-sufficient maturity about her features in sharp contrast to the apparent youthfulness of her figure. Pat closed his eyes wearily after staring at her for a full 30 seconds. It was a hell of a situation. He couldn't think of anything to say to the girl. She was sitting there gloating over him, by God, and that was that. She was sitting there watching him bleed to death and enjoying the spectacle with complete composure. What could a man say to a girl like that? It would be funny if he wasn't dying. A wave of sickness overcame Pat as he closed his eyes to shut out the girl's intent gaze. He felt himself drift downward into a bottomless pit of soft blackness. It was a comforting feeling. He welcomed the return of unconsciousness. It was better than trying to figure out things. The sound of a galloping horse nearing the ranch pulled him back sharply. He easily and carefully eased one eyelid open to watch the girl. She sprang to her feet, her face going white, one thin hand clutching the butt of her big gun while the other went to her breast. Pat watched and moved with his head so that his gaze could follow her to the door. She walked with a free, swinging stride that was oddly graceful. She opened the door a cautious crack as the hoof-beats stopped outside. Her gun clattered to the floor, and Pat heard a glad cry spring from her lips. "Clarence! It's you, Clarence!" Spurs jingled outside. A gruff voice said, "Sure, it's me, Helen. Who'd you think it'd be?" The girl swayed forward in the doorway. A man's arms enveloped her tightly, and Pat watched the scene without moving. The man patted the girl's shoulder and stepped up onto the threshold. He was a broad-shouldered young man with a black mustache that drooped above a hard mouth. He had broad features that took on an expression of amazement when he saw Pat laying on the floor in a pool of blood. His big-fingered hand tightened on the girl's shoulder, and he demanded, "What's going on here, Helen? Who's this hombre?"
"He's one of the gang that's been after Dad, Clarence."
Helen leaned against his bulky body, sobbing quietly.
I shot him. Something terrible happened to Dad. He's
"Not dead?" ejected the young man sharply.
I don't know. I'm afraid."
Helen checked herself, shaking her head with the smoothly coiled black hair.
"He's gone, Clarence. It all started about an hour ago. Somebody called Dad to the door, and it was raining terribly. And the shooting started as soon as Dad opened the door. And he ran out into the night, and he hasn't come back. And then this man came riding up and tried to pull a gun on me, but I shot him first."
Helen paused to glance at Pat, shuddering.
"I dragged him inside, and then I got to thinking about poor Dad and all the troubles he's had, and so I left him laying there on the floor. I think he's dying."
She ended in a tragic whisper.
"He opened his eyes and looked at me a minute ago, and then passed out before he could say anything."
Clarence stepped forward, saying angrily, "Well, good enough for him. You should have left him out there in the mud where he belonged. You can see he's a stranger. An imported gunman, I reckon." Pat cautiously closed his eyes as the young man knelt beside him. He used all of his willpower to keep his face calm and his body lax to stimulate unconsciousness as Clarence rudely rolled him over and inspected the wounds beneath his clothing. He heard the girl move around quickly, and then kneel beside him and felt her quick breath on his cheek as she cried out,
Is he dead, Clarence?"
"Not yet, I reckon. Too bad you didn't put that bullet an inch closer to his heart. Would have saved the law a lot of trouble if you had."
"Thank God," she breathed softly. "Even if he was a killer, I don't want his blood on my hands."
The young man squatted on his spurred heels and grunted. "Well, that'd be downright plumb silly. He'll hang anyway. What's the matter? Who finishes off? Damned if I ain't got half a mind to myself."
"No, Clarence, you mustn't. Don't be touching your gun. Not with him laying there helpless like that."
"Women," stated Clarence heavily, "are sure funny critters. He did your daddy in, didn't he? Either killed Moses or wounded him, maybe, and dragged him out of there and then turned him over to the rest of the gang to keep out of the way while he came back after you, meaning to do only God knows what with you, thinking that you was alone and defenseless. Still, now you don't want him killed." Still pretending to be unconscious, Pat's pulse throbbed when he heard Clarence name the girl's father. Moses. Mose Higgins, of course. The old friend with whom he had ridden from Powder Valley to help. So this was Mose's ranch, and this straight-shooting young girl was Moses' daughter, the little gal Moses mentioned in his letter. Pat had to repress sternly an impulse to lift up his voice and announce who he really was. They mightn't believe the truth. He was learning things as he lay there, seemingly unconscious. He listened while Helen Higgins spoke again. She spoke softly and slowly, as though arguing the matter out with herself.
"It wouldn't have mattered there at first, whether it was him or me, and I tried to kill him. I knew I had to shoot before he did, but it's different now. He isn't dangerous anymore. He's utterly defenseless. You can't kill a man in cold blood."
A note of horror crept into her voice, and a silent shudder ran through her. "I could," Clarence told her coldly. "I could do it as easy as finishing off a rattlesnake."
"You're a deputy sheriff, Clarence. You're sworn to uphold the law. What you're suggesting would be murder."
Sure, I'm a deputy sheriff, so I gotta arrest this killer's carcass and then carry him into town, and then we'll lock him up and nurse him back to good health. Also, we can loop a rope around his neck and hang him later. Does that make sense to you? It sure doesn't to me." Pat Stevens winced inwardly at the young deputy's rough but inescapable logic. He didn't blame Clarence much for feeling as he did. Pat himself had often been guilty of such thoughts in the past, and he had seen plenty of times in the past where it looked foolish as all get out to bother to save a man from death just to let the law take its course in the end. Yet a man simply couldn't allow himself to give way to such thoughts. It wasn't healthy. At least it certainly wasn't going to be healthy for Pat Stevens if Helen Higgins allowed herself to be persuaded by Clarence. Relief flooded through him when he heard the girl get to her feet and say coldly,
"I don't like to hear you talking that way. No matter what's happened to Dad, we haven't any right to let this man die on our hands. You open up his clothes while I get some hot salt water."
She moved away rapidly, going to the kitchen, Pat presumed, and he lay rigid, waiting to see what Clarence would do. The young man did nothing for several minutes, and then he cursed angrily deep in his throat and rocked forward on his knees and began roughly tearing Pat's blood-soaked jacket and shirt away from his torso. Pat groaned feebly and then louder, as though the pain was bringing him back to consciousness. He made his eyelids flutter, then jerked them wide open and stared up into the grim face of this young man. He discovered that he had conceived a violent dislike for Clarence in the interim. He had thought him a rather personable young fellow while he first covertly watched him enter and embrace Helen. Now, however, he discerned a ruthlessness about the features that escaped him at first. Clarence scowled blackly down at him and snorted. "Now decide to come back to life, huh? What happened to Mr. Higgins?" Pat feigned complete ignorance of what happened. He muttered, Where am I? What happened?" "You got what you got coming to you, only not quite," Clarence told him viciously. "Where's the rest of your gang?" I don't know what you're talking about. Me, I was just wandering waddily looking for a dry place to lay down my body. And I ride up here, and then bingo, a girl starts throwing lead at me. That's all I know."
"Is he awake, Clarence?"
Helen called eagerly, hurrying in from the kitchen with a steaming pan of water.
"What'd he say about Dad?"
"Nothing but a pack of lies," Clarence grunted in a sour tone. "He fixed himself up a story about not knowing nothing. Claims he was just riding by some innocent like and stopped to find a place to get out of the wet. Well, that's what comes for petting a killer." He went on angrily. "He'll try to wiggle out of the law's noose sure as shooting. Country would be better off if you'd just let him lay there and finish off dying." Helen set the pan of water on the floor and knelt beside it. Her great black eyes were fixed upon Pat's face in consternation, and she cried,
"Maybe he's telling the truth, Clarence. When I saw him, I just naturally supposed."
"And you supposed right," the deputy sheriff growled. "He pulled a gun on you, didn't he? He's packing 2 guns, ain't he? Ever hear of a plain cowpuncher wanting with 2 guns? And you heard him shooting it out with your dad, didn't you?"
"Somebody shot it out with Dad,"
she corrected him softly. She dipped a cloth into the hot salt solution and began bathing Pat's wounds. Her first bullet had been drilled cleanly through the muscles of his right arm, but a second had smashed through his ribs 3 inches below the shoulder, making a nasty mess of that side of his chest. "Well, who could have it been but him?" Clarence got to his feet, walked angrily up and down the room, fuming. "After all the trouble your daddy had lately. By God, Helen, you're one unnatural daughter. Your father's missing, killed most like, and out there in the dark and wet, and you're squatting in here playing nursemaid to a 2-gun killer."
"We'll let the law decide that," she told him calmly. "That is if he lives to come to trial. This wound in his chest looks pretty bad to me. Hand me that dry cloth so I can bind it tight. The bullet did come out, and that's one good thing.
Clarence angrily handed her the required cloth and then resumed his pacing. Well, maybe he won't reach the jail alive, he hazarded darkly. A fellow like him's liable to make a break for it, knowing he's heading for a noose anyway. If I have to shoot him while he's trying to escape, I reckon I can't be blamed for that. Helen Higgins finished binding Pat's wounds tightly. She rocked back on her heels, angry, and scorn flashed in her black eyes.
I don't think much of a man who uses his law badge as an excuse for killing.
Clarence stopped and looked at her. Meaning me?
I could mean you, couldn't I? Isn't that what you're halfway pining away to do to this man?
Didn't say that I planned it that way, just said if he should try to make a getaway.
Which prisoners have a strange way of doing when they're in your custody, don't they?
Helen was eyeing the young man queerly, half nodding her head as though confirming a long-held suspicion. He blustered. I don't know what you're talking about. If you're through coddling that there killer, I'll load him on his horse and get started.
You must know what I'm talking about. You remember that you captured 2 members of the Lacy gang in the last 2 months and killed both of them trying to escape while you were taking them to jail.
Helen got to her feet slowly.
Well, this man is my prisoner. Well, sort of. I feel responsible for him, and I think I'll ride in with you just to see that nothing happens.
You don't know what you're saying, Clarence protested. He stepped towards Helen, extended his arms. You're just all upset about this here shooting. You can't ride out tonight. Maybe Moses will be coming back. Helen eluded his embrace and slipped away from him to catch up her slicker hanging near the door.
You go on out and saddle a horse for me, she ordered with a quiet finality. I'm riding with you to San Alicia. If Dad's able to get back here, he'll be able to take care of himself.
For a moment, Clarence hesitated, a slow flush of anger suffusing his face. Then he turned and flung himself out the door with a muttered oath of exasperation. End of chapter 3.